What's in a name? In your personal life, your name has a very close association with your identity. It's probably the first thing that comes to mind when somebody thinks about you. Your name could have ties to who you are as a person. It could have ties to your family and where you come from. And it could have ties to the history of your family. So a name might give insight into history and culture and geography, identity. There's a ton of great stories in fiction or fantasy or sci-fi where one of the characters knows one of the other characters' names, and knowing somebody's name can give you control or knowledge or power over them. For Shakespeare, or maybe I should say for Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, a name is just a name. It doesn't really mean anything. She says, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. A rose, not a rose, would smell just as sweet." The idea is that a name is just a label that we put on something in order to try to make sense of the experience of what it is. So you could call a rose a flower, and it won't really change what that rose is. It won't change the smell of it, or the visual of it, or the feelings that it evokes. But historically, names matter. And they do come to have meaning. Because ultimately, when decades or millennia pass by, all we're left with is the name and what it symbolizes and what it means to the people who are looking at it. A name will come to have meaning, even if it was just an invented label slapped onto something haphazardly. If people still abide by that name over the course of history, then 500 years later, that's what you are. Which brings us to the Aztec Empire. When you think about the name Aztec and what that name symbolizes about the Aztec Empire, who they were as a people, and what we know about them, the name carries a meaning and a story. We think of apocalyptic religious beliefs. We think of human sacrifice, war, brutality, superstition, and maybe most prominently, the Spanish conquest of the Aztec. All of this is what's in a name for the Aztec name. But what's interesting here is that the name Aztec is completely made up. There were no Aztec people. Nobody at the time of the Aztec Empire would have said they were Aztec. The term Aztec seems to have been essentially made up by historians to describe this particular empire that was flourishing in the 1400s and early 1500s in modern-day Mexico. The people themselves would have called themselves the Mexica, Mexica. And when we think about the Mexica people and how we've assigned a name to them that they themselves would not have used, and when you think about the narratives that the term Aztec comes with in the modern day and the things that most of us have learned about the Aztec Empire, narratives of apocalypse and war and human sacrifice, superstition, you begin to wonder if that name of Aztec is just a label, and if it doesn't fully represent the Mexica people, then what else about that story is misrepresented, or doesn't fully add up, or is misleading, or is blatantly false? And when you combine this idea of what a name means and what a label means, when you combine that with the romanticism of the history behind the Aztec Empire, and particularly their clash of civilizations with the Spanish Empire, you have the makings of a very intriguing historical event. And it was a clash of civilizations. In 1519, when the Spanish, led by Hernando Cortez, and the Aztec, led by their Emperor Moctezuma, when they met outside the enormous pyramids of Tenochtitlan, this was two fully organized, top dog empires near the peak of their powers, who a mere handful of years before were pretty much completely unaware of the other's existence. The war that followed and the aftershocks of that war and the Spanish occupation of Mexico would be felt for hundreds of years and are still felt today. So when we talk about names and meanings and narratives, here's why it matters. Because it might be history's greatest story. And it's so dramatic because nothing like this story will ever happen again. At least not on this planet. Now, as you might expect here, there's a lot of little bits of information and misconceptions that need to get out of the way before you can even start to tell the story. When we talk about the Mexica people, we are talking about a ethnic group that originated in the modern-day Southwest United States, migrates down into what we would now call Mexico, and settles in the city of Tenochtitlan. The empire that Mexica ethnic group forges, we now call the Aztec Empire. So the empire and the city-states that were allied to it can be called the Aztec Empire, while the Mexica were the ethnic group that essentially made up the empire. From a historical scholarship perspective, it's one of those interesting questions, right? Because, again, this term Aztec was a later creation, something that came hundreds of years after the Mexica people created and lost their empire. But the term Aztec is what everybody knows them as, at least the common person. And it's what most people use in the common day to avoid confusion, because probably the average person who doesn't know the story, they don't know what Mexica means. So it seems that a lot of people in the history realm use the terms Aztec and Mexica pretty much synonymously, although they don't exactly mean the same thing. Another thing to note is that the Mexica people spoke what's called Nahua, Nahua. So the Mexica belonged to a sort of larger language and cultural group that we call the Nahua. We'll get into this later, but there are still about 1 million Nahua speakers in modern-day Mexico today. Another important thing to note is that for hundreds of years, almost everything we knew about the Aztec people and Aztec history comes from the perspective of the Spanish. And this is because of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire from 1519 to about 1521. For many people that are interested in this subject, that's all there is to it. How a couple hundred conquistadors on what was essentially an exploratory mission conquered one of the great empires of all time, toppled it completely. This story of the Spanish conquest has evoked controversy, and it's the subject of heated historical debates about how it happened, why it happened, what it says about the Spanish, and what it says about the Aztec in the process. And again, for many people, that's all there is. But we have to understand that there's actually hundreds, thousands of years of history before the Spanish arrive that are going to be relevant to the story of the Mexica people. And for millions of people, there was life after 1521. History didn't suddenly end when the war ended, although that seems to be the way many people in the history world think, unfortunately. So given all of that, a lot of what we know comes from the Spanish perspective. The Mexica people generally didn't have a writing system in the same way the Spanish did. They certainly had an oral tradition that spanned hundreds of years at least, but their writing system was not a phonetic system. It was more pictographs and these types of things that could be used in ledgers and religious ceremonies where pictures could represent larger meanings and stories. But very few of these survived the Spanish purging after the conquest, and so we don't have a lot of the original Aztec writings or really much of what they wrote down before 1519. So this has shaped the story of how we view the Aztec Empire in all kinds of ways. And some of the brutality and the myth of the Aztec Empire, and when I say myth here, I don't mean myth that it was false. I mean kind of this larger than life story that has become ingrained in the minds of textbooks and history classes and popular culture. Again, because all of the histories were written down by Spanish. Hernando Cortez wrote letters on a consistent basis. The people that were with him during the conquest of the Aztec Empire were writing letters home. They were writing journals. After the conquest, they were writing things and trying to put it into narrative format in order to sell books. And all of this put the Aztec Empire, from a history perspective, into a box. And the name of the Aztec came to be associated with the idea of the human sacrificing, superstitious barbarian. Historian Camilla Townsend, in her book Fifth Son, says, quote, "The picture of the Aztecs that has emerged is blood-curdling. The flint knives with their embedded eyes, the sacrificial stones, the skull racks, all leave indelible images in the imagination. We moderns look at them and then invent the accompanying scene, the spoken words, the music, and the context. We envision orgies of violence, like the one depicted in the film Apocalypto. Textbooks present these same images and teach young people that the nobler native peoples were waiting to be released from a regime of such cruelty. The books written by 16th century Spaniards likewise encouraged readers to believe that the people whom the conquistadors defeated were barbaric in the extreme, that God willed the end of their civilization as it encapsulated all that was wrong with human nature. Even those written by more sympathetic observers, those Spaniards who lived in an indigenous community and learned the language, are filled with condescension towards the people they never quite came to understand, interpreting events through a European set of expectations, and thus seeing the choices the Indians made as bizarre at best." End quote. As Camilla Townsend points out there, if we only look at one side of the story, we're not going to get a three-dimensional perspective on who the Mexica people were and what the Aztec Empire was all about. And what's interesting is that after the conquest, many people in the former Aztec Empire who were being incorporated into the Spanish colonial system began to learn how to speak and write Spanish. And on the flip side, some Spanish priests or friars or educators of some sort also learned the Nahua language and writing system. And so you get this post-conquest history that begins to start incorporating the indigenous voices into the story. One of these historical documents is called the Florentine Codex. And it's just one example of a Nahua or Mexica history that begins to start incorporating some of the oral tradition from before the Spanish conquest, and then they are able to start writing it down. And over time, as historians have debated it and tried to decide how much of that story is valid, given that a lot of it comes from oral tradition, maybe hundreds or even thousands of years old. They try to figure out which parts represent bias on which side and which parts match up with the Spanish description of things. And over time, we've gotten a more three-dimensional view of who the Aztecs were. It's also very much worth mentioning that leading this charge of historians painting the Aztec Empire and the Mexica people in a more three-dimensional perspective is historian Camilla Townsend. I think her book, Fifth Son, is one of the best history books I've read, period, and it forms the backbone, really, of this podcast series. We're going to cite a bunch of other historians and anthropologists and all of these types of people, but Fifth Son by Camilla Townsend is absolutely recommended if you want to learn about the Aztec Empire. And that's what we are going to do with this podcast series. And we're going to start where all good stories start, at the beginning. The beginning of this story starts with the migrations of early man all the way from Africa into Asia, across the Siberian land strait into what we would now call Alaska, into North America, through Central America into South America. We know that early man, at least as we know it, began in Africa, and there are these migrations that go out from Africa, spreading into different regions of the Eastern Hemisphere. The dates on this vary, but Camilla Townsend seems to think that around 14,000 BC or 13,000 BC, or somewhere around there, hunter-gatherer tribes begin moving across this land bridge that connects Asia with the Americas. Nowadays, we call this the Bering Strait, and that land bridge doesn't exist anymore because around 11,000 BC, the land bridge melted, separating the two worlds, Western Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere, Old World and New World. And by the way, there is huge historical debate about when exactly these migrations happened and how early humanity made it into the Americas. There is some evidence that perhaps some groups of humans preceded these migrations south, and maybe they were sea people, or maybe they were going on canoes that got out ahead of the migrations. And we see some evidence from a little bit before the period of the main consensus of when these migrations happened. But for our purposes here, we're not going to focus on that stuff too much. We do know that these nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes are moving across the Bering Strait sometime around 13,000 years ago, and they're traveling through Alaska, through what we would now call Canada, and eventually landing close to the southwest United States. The question might be why? Why were these nomadic peoples moving south through the Americas? Perhaps they were just following the herds. We know that early hunter-gatherers probably did not rely on agriculture as much as a settled society of the modern day would. Maybe they were fleeing war or violence of some sort. Maybe they were looking for resources, or maybe they were just desperate. It might also be important to mention here that the vast distance that these migrations into the Americas had to travel was a lot further than the early groups of humans who settled in Europe or the Middle East or Asia. So some have argued that because of this, the development of agriculture that we begin to see happening when early man goes from hunting and gathering to mostly agriculture, that development happens much later in the Americas than it does in the Old World. And there's a lot of debate about how that transition to agriculture happens and why that transition to agriculture happens. But there's no debate that most societies in the world are now settled and rely on farming as sort of the basis of their food operation, and everything kind of goes from there. There's lots of interesting discussions to be had around this transition from early human, from hunter-gatherer to mostly agriculture. I did a series on this about James C. Scott's book, Against the Grain, a long time ago. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. But it's important to note that the development of agriculture by early humans was not necessarily a linear progression. In that series, I called it a carousel. So it wasn't like people suddenly discovered how to farm and then immediately plopped down, and then all of the quote-unquote benefits of civilization that happen as a result of that, job specialization, trade, growing populations, more cities, all of those things don't just suddenly start happening right after the first person starts farming. In many areas of the world, there is this carousel where people continue to hunt and gather. They might mix in some farming here and there, and depending on the geography around them or the situation that they and their people are in, they might rotate between different strategies for feeding and sustaining themselves. In her book, Fifth Son, Camilla Townsend talks about this carousel idea, and she notes that things don't always happen in the same order or in a linear progression, like we just said. And we also shouldn't assign morality to the development of agriculture. In other words, as James C. Scott argues as well, just because you have a more sophisticated state that is more able to do a wider variety of things, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a better way to live than maybe that hunting, gathering, carousel lifestyle and the benefits that that could give you. But Camilla Townsend does say that agricultural societies do tend to become more powerful civilizations. And this would seem to track with common sense. If you forget about the morals, farming civilizations do tend to dominate. Camilla Townsend says, quote, "Not that farmers are necessarily happier than hunter-gatherers, or smarter, or more moral, nor do they always invent the same things in the same order, or even the things we would expect them to invent. The ancient Andean farmers, for example, never thought of straining plant fibers through screens to create paper on which to write, as those in the Old World did. Instead, they wrote in knots and braids along colored cords and tied them together to record their prayers and their tax records. And the Europeans, later famous for their fighting, were not the ones to create the first explosives. The supposedly peaceful and self-contained Chinese did that. The point is that farming peoples always developed mightier civilizations, in the sense of being able to defeat people who had not developed comparable weapons and goods, and whose populations had not grown equivalently." End quote. Ultimately, agriculture does lead to a more sedentary lifestyle, growing populations, more inventions and technology, cities, and, as Camilla Townsend pointed out there with gunpowder, trade, sophisticated economic strategies and resources. And her argument here is that because those migrations all the way back from Africa across the Bering Strait into the Americas, because that group of migrations was the last and longest distance to travel, it took about an extra 5,000 years for agriculture to emerge in large quantities and in serious intensity in the Americas. So that's why in your history textbooks, we learn about the ancient river valley civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, India. They were much more ahead of the game in terms of settling down, developing bigger populations, trading, developing new technologies and strategies to become more powerful. And you can add on to this that in the Americas, they didn't have access to the same crops. So there was no wheat, there was no peas, which were certainly beneficial crops to people of the old world. All that being said, corn became the primary crop of the people of Mesoamerica, beans as well. And we do see more settled agricultural farming societies by right around 1500 BC in the Americas. but this difference or this lag in time where the old world is developing agriculture and long distance trade and all of the specialization of labor, these types of things are developing much faster in the old world than they are in the new world. And that's going to make a big difference in the story later on. The first major settled agricultural civilization that we know about in Mesoamerica, or basically modern-day Mexico, is called the Olmec civilization. They lasted from around 1500 BC to about 400 BC. We're not exactly sure what happened to make them decline, but we do know that they developed corn and bean agriculture. They mixed in fishing and seafood into their diet. They had particular cultures and institutions that influenced most of the other civilizations in Mexico, including the Maya. The Maya were a collection of city-states that often made war on each other, and often one city-state would dominate for a period of time. They were located on the Yucatan Peninsula of eastern Mexico, and we still can see the grand architecture that they created at places like Chichen Itza. And speaking of grand architecture, the city of Teotihuacan eventually becomes the inheritor of central Mexican power after the Olmec and a city-state called Cuicuilco have their demise. Teotihuacan flourished from about 200 to 600 CE. We can still see the incredible ruins of the city even today. And at its height, the city must have been something to see. Camilla Townsend says, quote, "Between the 200s and the 600s, in the wake of Cuicuilco's destruction by the volcano, the population of the 20 square mile city rose to an astounding 50,000. The most sumptuous households were for the nobility, but each neighborhood was impressive in its own right, and each had its own character and trade. The largest neighborhood was that of the obsidian craftsmen, who worked with the volcanic material that resembled black glass, making spearheads, knives, statues, jewelry, and mirrors. Indeed, the city had been founded near an important obsidian mine, and when it was exhausted, the people found another mine 70 kilometers away and began to have the stone carried to them by slaves from conquered states. The potters were also known for their expertise. Like the obsidian products, their work was sent hundreds of miles away, where other goods were traded in exchange. In small enclaves in the city lived merchants from other regions, whose presence guaranteed the continuance of long-distance trade. In the remains of their cooking and their garbage pits, they left behind evidence of their foreign ways of doing things. All around the city, in a great circle, were the huts of the farming peoples and their irrigation ditches. The farmers did not feed the city all on their own, however. Other foodstuffs came in as payments of tribute from less powerful peoples. The city apparently even made war on or traded with some of the Maya kingdoms, far to the east, for the influence of Teotihuacan was later visible there." End quote. So this incredible city-state influences basically all of Mexico from around 200 to 600. Architecture, stories, art, astronomy, war. And future civilizations, including the Aztec, would see themselves as the inheritors of this tradition. Teotihuacan going all the way back to the Olmec. Now in 650 CE, there was a great rebellion of some sort in Teotihuacan. It was probably of peasants or slaves, based on how we know that from the archaeological evidence, the peasants or slaves who were involved in the rebellion burned down palaces and temples, but they did not burn ordinary homes. So usually in this region of the world, or even in other regions of the world, when we're talking about war, we see the opposite pattern emerge, where the houses of the ordinary people are the ones that get wiped out, burned and pillaged, while the upper classes generally can retreat behind their wealthy barriers. So the fact that the temples and the wealthier palaces were burned makes historians think that this must have been some sort of peasant or slave rebellion. And as Teotihuacan is declining, we also see a lot of nomadic migrant people raiding their way south from what nowadays we would call the American Southwest. These groups of migrants are the cultural group and language group that we call the Nahua. So there's different ethnic groups that make up the Nahua cultural group, but the Mexica are one of these Nahua groups that are migrating south during this period around 500, 600 CE. You also have ethnic groups like the Chichimet or the Colwa. And these groups all share this Nahua cultural tradition and this Nahua language. The Mexica in particular have a lot of distinct cultural and societal developments. The development of the bow and arrow doesn't come until around the year 500, but you can imagine why it would be helpful for a group of nomadic migrant people who are raiding their way south. They have sophisticated timekeeping and calendar systems with two parallel streams, astronomical and ceremonial, similar to our current system where we have a 365-day year centered around the Earth going around the sun, and we also have a Monday to Sunday ceremonial week. The Nahua migrants and the Mexica began streaming into central Mexico, and they also pick up a lot of the central Mexican traditions, stuff from Teotihuacan, stuff from the Olmec, cultural traditions like sports and games that they play in towns or town squares, or even in the center of cities surrounded by pyramids. Eventually, another empire known as the Toltec Empire picks up the power vacuum left behind by Teotihuacan, and they rule from about 600 to 1200-ish in certain parts of central Mexico. The Toltec were a mix of the Chichimet, who were one of the Nahua nomadic groups, and there were probably some other central Mexican, Mesoamerican, Olmec influenced cultures in there as well. And around 1200, the Toltec civilization would decline, and Chichimet influence with it as well. They would become wanderers once again. Chichimet, by the way, means dog people, nomads, and this is something that a Nahua cultural group would be proud of. These Nahua migrations and the Mexica migrations with them lasted for hundreds of years, and they were influenced by the civilizations that came before them, like the Olmec or Teotihuacan. And again, you can try to imagine what it might have been like for a Nahua group to come across the ruins of Teotihuacan in the year 650 or so, seeing these incredible pyramids and incredible structures, seeing them completely abandoned, and then being the inheritors of that grand civilization. You can get a hint at how amazed the Mexica people must have been by the ruins of Teotihuacan just by the name Teotihuacan, which means the place of those who had great gods, or the birthplace of the gods. And so you have these nomadic people who are in absolute awe over this incredible city, yet they have their own deep and incredible culture and background and history, and they view themselves as the protectors of Teotihuacan and what it represents, even if in some ways they are outsiders. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of the Western Roman Empire, right? Where the western part of the Roman Empire is declining, and by 476, the city of Rome is getting sacked by what the Romans would call barbarians. But what's interesting is that those barbarians the very same ones that the Romans called uncivilized, would spend the next 500, 1,000 years, maybe more, trying to lay claim to the influence and the heritage of ancient Rome. So in a similar way, these Nahua peoples and the Mexica were nomadic wanderers who became the inheritors of this older, grander civilization. But the Mexica brought their own beliefs and their own culture to the table as well. They were never the most powerful of these migrant groups, at least not at first, and they developed a very underdog perspective. They often found themselves under the foot of some of the other Nahua nomadic groups, in particular the Kolwa, and it seems that they would often lose those battles. Camilla Townsend talks about a princess of the Mexica known as Shieldflower, who was taken as a prisoner of war in one of these battles with King Kashkash of the Kolwa, and she was burned at the stake. Camilla Townsend talks about the Mexica princess getting burned here, saying, quote, "As the flames rose, Shieldflower stood tall. She now had nothing left to lose. Tears streamed down her face, and she screamed at her enemies. 'People of Teotihuacan, I go to where my God lives. My people's descendants will all become great warriors. You will see.' After she died, the Kolwas washed her blood and ashes away, but they could not wash away the dread that her words had awakened in them." End quote. Townsend goes on to say, quote, "It isn't necessary to believe that we can hear the exact words of this conversation held in 1299 to know that the essentials are true. Archaeological and linguistic evidence, as well as the written historical annals of multiple Mexican towns, all indicate that the ancestors of the people, now known as the Aztecs, came down from the north over the course of several centuries. That those who came last found themselves without land, and that they then had to jockey for power in the fertile Central Valley. We know how they waged war, and we recognize the symbolic significance of the chiefly daughters and sisters raised to mother the next generation's chiefs. We even know that the people of the valley educated their noble girls to be almost as stoical as their brothers in times of duress, and that Shieldflower and Lily were both common indigenous names for noble daughters. In short, the story of Shieldflower would have been the story of more than one young woman." End quote. So hopefully we can start to piece together this picture of Mesoamerican history. We have a little bit of a combination of more settled civilizations who are exerting influence through architecture and culture and institutions, places like Teotihuacan or the old Olmec civilization or the Toltecs. And mixed in with that, we have these nomadic groups. The Nahua was the major migratory group, and they consisted of ethnic groups like the Mexica or the Kolwa or the Chichimec. And sometimes it was hard to distinguish which one was the settled civilization, which one was the nomad. We do have this carousel of different groups taking power at different times. And we do have this idea that the Mexica are viewing themselves not just as the underdog who is prepared to have their moment in the sun, but they're also the inheritors of grander civilizations that came before them. And as Camilla Townsend points out in that story with Shieldflower being burned at the stake by her enemies, she's vowing revenge. This is a hard, tough people who have dealt with a harsh migration over thousands of miles over the course of hundreds of years. They've developed enemies, they've fought wars, and they've endured. They've survived. And that's what it meant to be a Mexica. They believed that sacrifice was necessary to achieve greatness, and they believed that their time would come. Maybe the oldest Mexica story that we know about centers around this idea of sacrifice and how they thought the world began. Camilla Townsend shares the story that's found in a document called the Annals of Tlatelolco, a Mexica history from the 16th century. Quote, "The Aztecs would never recognize themselves in the picture of the world that exists in the books and movies that we have made. They thought of themselves as humble people who had made the best of a bad situation and had shown bravery and thus reaped its rewards. They believed that the universe had imploded 4 times previously, and they were living under the 5th sun, thanks to the extraordinary courage of an ordinary man. Elders told the story to their grandchildren. When all was in darkness, when the sun had not yet shone and the dawn had not yet broken, the gods gathered and spoke among themselves. The divinities asked for a volunteer from the few humans and animals creeping about in the darkness. They needed someone to immolate himself and thus bring forth a new dawn. A man who was very full of himself stepped forward and said he would do it. Who else, the gods asked, but their question was met with silence. None dared, no one else came forward. The gods called on a quiet man who sat listening. His name was Nahua. He had not thought of himself as a hero, but he accepted the task readily, on the grounds that the gods had been good to him in the past. The 2 men were made ready for sacrifice, the proud hero receiving beautiful, precious accoutrements, but Nahua only paper trinkets, reeds, and pine needles. At last, it was time. The hero went forward. The flames flared up high, and he became terrified. He stopped in the fear, turned about, went back. He tried again. But he could in no way dare to do it. The gods turned to Nahua and stared at him. He hardened his heart, shut his eyes firmly, and did not stop short. He jumped. His flesh crackled and sizzled. The gods sat waiting. Then began the reddening of the sky all around, and the sun rose in the east, its life-giving rays penetrating everywhere. Without fanfare, Nahua had done what was needed to save life on Earth." End quote. So the Mexica believed that despite their small beginnings, if they continued to sacrifice and live humbly, they would eventually have their moment. And as Shieldflower proclaimed in that story we quoted earlier, they would have their revenge. And all the other peoples of central Mexico and all the other Nahua migrants who weren't allied with the Mexica would pay. The Mexica believed that they just needed one break. Something would go their way once, they would get lucky one time, and that would propel them where they wanted to go. At some time in the mid-1300s, on their migrations, in their nomadic lifestyle, the Mexica came across a lake. There was an island in the center of the lake, and there was nobody else around. The land was marshy and difficult to live on, but the Mexica thought they could farm on it. They knew that they could catch fish in the lake, and they thought it might be a place to build a great city. After hundreds of years of wandering and suffering, the Mexica had finally found their place. They had found their moment. And maybe soon they could find their revenge. The Mexica called this city on the lake Tenochtitlan. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.